Good morning, everyone. Thank you for everyone who has joined us today. We'll be getting going in a few minutes' time once more people have signed on. Thanks for all of you who's put in your job titles in. Again, it's just really helpful for me to see who I'm speaking to. As usual, I'm just sharing a few links with you. If you want to get in contact with me for any reason, then please do so. In case any of you haven't been to some of our other ones where I've done this as well, I'm just going to put in some links for some new publications in relation to trafficking, which have been released. The first is new statutory guidance, and then the next one is the new NRM statistics for 2019. So if you are not aware of those documents and they're relevant to your work, then please go and have a look at them. Okay, so we've got about half of us here, so we're going to be getting going now. Thanks for more of you who have joined us and added in what your job roles are. So this webinar will be focused on spiritual abuse and trafficking. It is very much an introduction. We do have a whole day's training course on this, so it's not something that we can go over in just 45 minutes. Just a disclosure, we're not experts in spiritual abuse. We have what we're going to be sharing today is what we've learned, and it's what we've learned from our young people that we've worked with. So in our youth program, we over the years have had a lot of young people tell us about this aspect of trafficking and their experiences in it, and that's very much how we've come to present on this topic. Really, is what we've learned from our young people. So yeah, we are not experts on this. What I will do is I'm going to direct you to Africa, which has some good resources on spiritual abuse. And then also the next one is the National FGM Centre. Now, I haven't done the usual technical support at the start. Can everyone see the slides? If you cannot, then if you're able to click the refresh button, you may be able to then. Yeah. Okay. So if you're looking for further guidance, then I would say just look really on do an internet search and look at some people and some organizations who are more experts in the field of spiritual abuse. I've given you the link to Africa. They've got a few research publications there which may be useful to you. And then, as I said, the FGM Centre does have some. And then also, when you look and do searches for this kind of information, increasingly churches and various different churches in the UK, not only are they releasing guidelines on their policy to their churches, but actually some have been providing information about spiritual abuse as well. So that might be, well, if you're going to do a search, then you'll see them come up as well. So yeah, that might be useful as well. I've kind of skipped over the introduction for us as an organization. That's because I'm assuming by now that most people who are in this webinar have been in other webinars, but just to introduce ECPAT, we're a child trafficking organisation. We do direct work with young people, which I've already talked about. We train professionals in issues of child trafficking and exploitation. We campaign around legislation as well as producing research ourselves. So just to move on then to spiritual abuse and trafficking, it's surprisingly interlinked, trafficking and spiritual abuse, and that's why we do sort of specifically train on these topics. But as a whole, spiritual abuse, there's a lot of misconceptions around what is included in it and what exactly it is. So that's kind of what I just want to get out of the way straight away. You will often be hear words like juju and witchcraft being used. Now, there can be problematic terms. It has quite negative connotations in the English language, something like witchcraft. But that tends to be how it's translated. But these are not necessarily evil practices. These are just belief systems, and there are rituals involved in these belief systems. And their primary sort of focus of these different rituals are for blessings. They're used in weddings. They're used to give people good fortune. So they're not intended for, and they're not designed to exploit people. They're not necessarily designed to curse people or anything like that. It's just a belief system, and like any belief system, they can be exploited and misused for ulterior motives as well as for good motives. Another misconception is it's not compatible with religions such as Christianity or Islam, or that it's not compatible with modern or rational thinking. Now, again, this is definitely a misconception. We see spiritual abuse happening in mainstream religions as well, particularly in this in the UK with Christianity. There have been numerous cases where they have been linked, and it can be in any religion really. Sometimes there have been concerns around spiritual abuse and maybe juju ceremonies or something, and there is evidence of this, but then what happens is that it's immediately dismissed because this young person is a Christian, or something similar like that. And what I just say to that is that we shouldn't be narrow-minded, that just because someone may identify as a Christian, it doesn't mean that they might not take part in rituals of other belief systems as well. It's much more a cultural practice than it is a religious practice. And then just to kind of explain this point further, if you look at work of social anthropologists, this one that I've mentioned is Evans Pritchard. Now, this is an ethnography, so it's a study of a culture, and it was probably published more than 100 years ago, I think. And it's about I can't remember which country it is in Africa, but it's looking at the belief system in that local community. And what is quite good, even though the language is very problematic because we were in a completely different century, is that he explains how these belief systems are compatible with rational thinking. So he calls it the second spear, and he uses an example of when someone is accused of witchcraft because the granary fell onto a collapsed and fell on top of someone and killed them. So they are not devoid of rational thinking, where they would believe that it wasn't the cause of the collapsing building um, causing the death, but what they have is this idea of what is behind the building collapsing, and that's what he called the second spear. So they might know that the spear is the one that kills the person, but there's something behind that, and that's can be quite useful for us. Is that the people who have these belief systems are not irrational, and they do have sort of modern outlooks or rational outlooks on life. I'm saying all these terms with quotation marks because I know that these terms are problematic, and therefore we shouldn't assume that they might not be following these beliefs. I think a good example of this is that in various different gangs in London, there is evidence that there's spiritual abuse happening, and these belief systems are being used even within these gangs. An example is that I've heard of situations where some rituals are happening, and they believe that these rituals are basically making their skin bulletproof, or it means that because they've had this ritual done, that if they're stabbed, then nothing will pierce the skin. So again, I think that can kind of explain to us how, um, just because someone may have um, believe more mainstream belief systems or in line with Western thinking, it doesn't mean that then they might not also take part in these ceremonies. So I'm not sure how well I described that. I probably used some problematic language in there, but it's not an easy thing to explain. So I hope that everyone got that. So now just going into a little bit more detail, how is it worked? So we mostly come into contact with it in relation to trafficking in the UK, with young people who have come from West African communities. However, that's certainly not the case always. So what I've described here is very much what we see in a lot of these rituals that are seen in West Africa, but it's certainly not just how I've explained it here, and it's certainly not just from West Africa. So at the top there, I've just explained some of these belief systems. So Kundoki and Ndoki, this is belief systems that has been linked to some spiritual abuse here in the UK. It's, from what I can understand, it's similar to some beliefs around juju, but it's from the Democratic Republic of Congo is where mostly these kind of beliefs are practiced. There's Obi, which I'm not sure if I pronounced that right, but you see that in Nigeria, but you also see it in Caribbean countries. Voodoo is something that you mostly see in Caribbean countries. Juju, again, is around Nigeria and some of the neighboring countries is where that is mostly practiced. But it's certainly not an exhaustive list. So ideas of jinns, which is present in the Middle Eastern Islamic cultures, and as well as in South Asian cultures. So in particular, in India, you see this idea of jinns, which is similar to spirit possession and can cause spiritual abuse. Before coming to ECPAT, I was working in Sri Lanka, and even there in the Buddhist culture and religion, their belief systems around what they call upala, which is it's essentially like negative karma or bad karma. When people have ideas about upala being sort of attached to a child, that is very much linked to child sexual exploitation. And it's something that I saw time and time again. So it's pervasive, it's throughout the world. It's not just certain belief systems that you see spiritual abuse in. It can be in any belief system. Okay, so I think we just need to make sure that we're not thinking narrowly with this, that it's a problem only certain cultures or certain belief systems have. So often there's some sort of ritual or ceremony that goes alongside it when it's related to trafficking. And it's designed to create a bond between the victim and trafficker. And it's designed to create a bond that goes beyond economic or usually the initial bond is economic, but it tries to go deeper. The ritual is connected to the contract that the victim and the trafficker has made. So usually how trafficking is started is usually they believe that the young person may believe that they're being smuggled into a country to have a good job. But actually what's happening is that they're being trafficked for exploitation. So there is usually a contract, an agreement of how the debt of the transportation will be paid, or the young person may promise to give a certain amount of money to the person who's trafficking them. And this ritual is linked to those contracts. Okay. And what it is it's aiming at giving consolidating that contract, so it's not merely an economic bond, but actually it's a spiritual bond as well. So it's exploiting a young person's beliefs to gain more control over that young person. I haven't I've had the option to include some YouTube videos of some of these rituals. I haven't done that. The reason why is what type of rituals do we actually choose? And also, some people they're not particularly nice to watch also. In the past I've had disagreements about this one isn't accurate or this one is being reinforcing stereotypes and the such. So I mean, you can have a look at some of these rituals on YouTube. There are plenty of videos that you see, but often some of them are they can be scary to watch. They can be very uncomfortable to watch. There's usually sacrifice of animals happening. There's usually, in several of these ceremonies, you kind of the person who is being exploited is covered in chicken blood or things like this. So they are specifically designed to stick in the mind of the person, so they're not forgetting this contract. And this sort of bond which has been made. And they're designed to assert control over the victim. So in a lot of these ceremonies, it's quite systematic that either blood or hair or something is taken from the young person's body, and that's part of the ritual. And what it again is there to do is kind of designed to assert control over someone. And often when this young person is being moved, and the person is being passed between traffickers, they will pass on this body part, whatever it is, or it might be a cloth which has that person's blood in, or it might be hair that's passed on. And again, it's linked to the belief that whoever has this has control over that person. And then beyond the spiritual aspects of the ceremony, it's often a ceremony which is attended by other people in their community. And again, this is to reinforce the control that the trafficker has over them, because it's not only the spiritual beliefs of the person which is keeping that control, but there's a social pressure, because this young person may have family members, it might have neighbors or extended sort of networks within the community who witness this ceremony, and they witness the promises that this person has made. So again, that just increases the control and the pressure of that young person to sort of stick to the contract and the promises that they may have made. And then often the oath, or whatever the person has been made to say, is the way that the victim has to invite the curse upon themselves if they do not do what is said. So these, if you sort of get these some of these rituals directly translated, a lot of it is sort of saying, I'm doing this voluntarily. If I go back on what I say I'm going to do, I am voluntarily bringing this punishment upon me. So again, that's what we commonly see or hear about in these ceremonies in relation to trafficking. I've just seen someone saying no ritual will ever be the same. Absolutely, that's definitely the case. It's really difficult to find out about what happens in these ceremonies. We're just trying to collect some information, and as much information as possible from our young people. And absolutely, that all of the information that I'm giving here comes with some warnings on it. Really is the fact that we don't know too much, and what we're saying is certainly not what we think always happens, and we're not sure how much we can generalize from what we know. So in terms of indicators, if you come across young people who have been trafficked from West Africa and the UK, it appears like they are much more vulnerable to this, or it's more likely that they would have had this kind of spiritual abuse that has happened to them. But absolutely, once again, we cannot assume that if a young person has come from West Africa, which that they have had this sort of abuse happen to them. And similarly, if we get trafficking victims from elsewhere, there's no reason to dismiss the concerns that this kind of abuse could have happened to them. This is a little bit more wider in terms of a general child protection sense, is that I would listen to the language that is being used to describe the child, whether by the child themselves or whoever is the carer of that person. What you often hear is very essentializing language, and there are certain words or certain ways that a young person is talked about that we need to be worried about. So if the discussion about the child is that they are bad or they are evil, if in particular we see in spiritual abuse cases in Christianity, is we see like needing deliverance. They are possessed. So we need to be really aware of this kind of very essentializing language. It's very hard to describe exactly what will be said. It will totally change between different cases, but just be aware and alert of how is this child spoken about? How is this child speaking about themselves, and how is a carer or someone else in the family speaking about this child? Different rituals will have different indicators just because of the specifics around it. Several of our young people have very similar markings on their body. And that's because razor blade cuts are made in several of these different ceremonies. And they're made on various different places on the body. Again, if you look on YouTube, there is a particular YouTube video of a Western tourist who is undertaking one of these rituals, but that video is quite good because it shows quite clearly where on the body these cuts are often made. They're often made on the face, underneath the eyes, on the back of the neck, underneath the knee, so on the back of the leg where the knee is, various different places on the arms as well. So yeah, the different rituals do have these kind of indicators. Often head shaving is part of some of these rituals as well. Generally, spiritual abuse is often another sort of indicator that it could be happening, is that there's signs of neglect for the child. So that's something that could be quite useful to look at. Being fearful of speaking, that's something that is very present in victims of exploitation anyway. However, for spiritual abuse, it's something that may be particularly prevalent. Along with some of these rituals, usually various different things are being said to them, such as this ritual will mean that if you try and tell anyone about this, no, they won't hear you. No one will be able to hear you. If you go to a police officer, you'll be invisible to them. So we've heard these kind of things being said before. We've also had, I don't think it was one of our young people. I think it's something that we've heard elsewhere. But again, the ritual was based on, if you tell anyone about this, then one of your family members may die or will die. So again, you might see that young people are particularly fearful about speaking out. Physical abuse can often be part of these rituals, so that can also indicate it. And these rituals are often done in conjunction with any sort of debt bondage. So if you are aware of young people who are in debt bondage, it's also possible that they've experienced this spiritual abuse as well. This has come more from other child protection cases, where you've seen spiritual abuse being a factor. However, it's also down as an indicator now to be aware of, is the family, is the alleged carer of the child and the child themselves, are they very committed to these various religious practices? I think in one serious case review, it talks about a carer of a young person who would go to church every day or something like that. And then it's what we are aware of as well is, in certain cultures, or in lots of cultures actually, it's not just in one or two, certain difficulties or disabilities that a child may have increases their vulnerability to experiencing spiritual abuse. So it's not an indicator in itself, but it's to be aware that certain young people are more vulnerable. Epilepsy is one that often comes up, and then also any other disabilities or learning difficulties and as such. Something that's often come up in serious case reviews as well, related to spiritual abuse, is if a young person is still bedwetting or has I've totally forgotten the. I used to know the medical term for enuresis. That's the one. So not being able to control your bladder. So if a young person has enuresis, then that can also increase their vulnerability they have towards being spiritually abused. Okay, so this slide just shows a couple of news articles. It's something which we may think is not very prevalent, but you'd be surprised about how prevalent spiritual abuse is. And it's not just prevalent in certain communities, it's all over the world. Something that often isn't really considered is that Victoria Climbié was a trafficked child. She was taken by extended family members under false pretenses to the UK. And then once she was here, she experienced considerable abuse, physical abuse and spiritual abuse, but she was a trafficked child. And if you look at that serious case review and the inquiry around her death, all 400 pages of it, not once is the word trafficking used in it. It's just not considered that she was a trafficked child, but she was. And she did have, she did experience spiritual abuse. Something that has come up a lot in the news is how juju ceremonies have been linked to sexual exploitation and trafficking of women to Italy, and throughout Europe as well. But if you just have a look at some of these news articles, it is very often people are being trafficked to Italy. The one that I have shown here on the screen, that's one that is linked to the UK as well. So next and finally, we'll talk about why does it have a specific link to trafficking? And this has come from a recent academic paper. A best kept secret of human traffickers is how they control and silence their victims. So the main role of spiritual abuse in trafficking is to exert control over the victim. It's very, very strong, and it's very sophisticated psychological control that it can exert over a victim, and that's why we see it being used so much, and it is often very effective. So linked to what I said earlier, it can really obstruct any sort of disclosures or evidence, and that is because of the specific part of certain spiritual abuse ceremonies, which have said that if you try and tell anyone, or if you tell anyone about me, then bad things will happen, or no one will hear you. Or if you go to a police officer, you'll be invisible to them. So this means that it does really inhibit the ability for professionals to explore possibilities of trafficking, just because it is such a powerful method of control. And also as well, I can't say that we have statistics and data to prove this, but I wouldn't be surprised if it increases the number of children going missing as well, just for the same reasons. Is that if professional services get hold of a child and puts them in foster care, and is trying to protect them, the likelihood is that something in this ritual means, or this kind of relationship with the trafficker means, that that young person will try very hard to escape and get back to where they were before. It increases the vulnerability of children to trafficking. So again, in my experience in Sri Lanka, what I found was it wasn't a direct cause, but what it meant is that when exploitation was happening, because of these ideas of upala and bad karma, it meant that people weren't actually responding to it, and family members weren't doing anything about the exploitation. So I've just added it in there, is that it can increase a young person's vulnerability to being trafficked in the first place if they are considered possessed, or if they're considered to have bad karma. It increases their vulnerability to trafficking. And then finally, it can increase the supply of trafficked children, but also it can increase the demand of trafficked children. So first of all, the supply. These rituals may not have a particular specifically been done to these young people who are victims. We've come across occasions where it was actually the parents who took part in this ritual when they borrowed money. Now, what happened was, the agreement was that if you do not pay back this money, then you have to give us your child to do this work. So it actually has increased the supply of children being trafficked, because it means that because of these abusive ceremonies, parents are more likely to hand over their children to traffickers. The second part of this is it increases the demand for children. So it is very distressing, but some of these ceremonies involve the body parts of children. So this is something that you see more in East Africa, is that children are trafficked for and then killed, and they're killed for their body parts to be taken part in these ceremonies. So thankfully that doesn't happen very much here. However, the link that I've just posted you is about a case which I'm not sure if anyone will remember, but it happened in 2001, and it was a case of a torso being found of a child in the River Thames. And what they basically, they never identified that child, but the investigations basically concluded that this was a trafficked child from Nigeria, and he was murdered, and his body parts were used to be taken part in one of these ceremonies. So it's not just about a method of control, but there are in many different ways where spiritual abuse does interact with trafficking. So just finally, this is what some of our young people have said in relation to their experiences with spiritual abuse and trafficking. So when I woke, he was standing over me. He told me that he was going to cut off my head and put it in the cupboard for good luck. Every night I thought I would be dead in the morning. He took my blood and hair, and now he has the power over me. So these can be common things that we hear when we try and get disclosures. This is what they're saying, and they're just absolutely terrified to make any sort of disclosures about what's happening. This next one, I know I'm not a witch, but I'm still afraid I can make bad things happen. And when we do our training, we have our young people who often co-deliver our training with us. One of them, she speaks really articulately about how she's come out of this exploitative situation now, and she's no longer at risk of being trafficked, and she's moved on with her life. But actually, even though cognitively she knows that she was abused and that what they told her would happen was wrong, she still believes it, and she still can't accept that it might not be true. And then this is something that we've kind of found, and this is what we go into in our training, is that it's often not very helpful at all to try and dismiss these kind of beliefs, because these beliefs can be really strong. So we shouldn't just say, oh, that's wrong, or that's silly, that's not going to happen, because it's just totally unhelpful for the young person. And then the last one was, she makes me drink tea, and it made me feel dizzy. So something we did find as well is that drugging of young people was also involved in a lot of these spiritual abuse ceremonies. Okay, so that's everything we have in terms of spiritual abuse. I know it was a very quick and sort of whistle-stop tour about it. As I said, we're not experts in this. What I've just tried to share with you is how we've come across it here at ECPAT. So I hope that it's useful for you. Please ask any questions if you do have them. I'll give you a few minutes to ask any questions. I'll just briefly mention our training again. So as well as training on spiritual abuse, we do training on missing from care and providing safe accommodation for child victims of trafficking. We do training on child criminal exploitation and trafficking, as well as an overview course for all aspects of trafficking as well. So if you are interested in any of our face-to-face training, then please get in contact with me. Apart from that, we have our final webinar tomorrow before I'm going to be furloughed until face-to-face training can continue. I have got good feedback from these webinars, so possibly we will continue them after as well. I've just posted a link on the open chat, which is our webinar tomorrow, which is going to be just looking at how we need to keep our minds open to the various different types of exploitation that a child may be facing, because it's quite easy to have blinkers on and just think about um, a single type of exploitation. So I've just seen one question come up. Interesting ritual. Any ideas what is called? No, I'm not sure about them. This is in the question is in relation to cases where we've heard of gangs here in London who have performed these rituals to make people seem bulletproof. Now, this is only something that I've heard secondhand from a professional. I'm not sure what groups they or what belief systems these do belong to. But my initial impression is that it doesn't matter what belief system it is that any of these rituals can be used and used in a way to say, if you undertake this ritual, then you will be bulletproof, or knives won't pierce your skin. Okay. So there's been a question from the family's point of view. Is there anything that can be done within communities? Yes, we do go into detail in our training about some of the ways that we can try and counteract this kind of training, this kind of spiritual abuse. There are things that can be done in the community. So again, maybe I would point you to organizations such as Africa who do a lot of specific work on spiritual abuse. What we do know is that it's not helpful to try and stop these ceremonies taking place, or just to raise awareness and say this is bad. But instead, what needs to happen is proper community engagement and sort of a dialogue that happens, so communities can be alert to these kind of rituals and beliefs being misused. Okay, so I've just read on the chat that lots of you are saying good things about these webinars. So thank you very much for them. I'm glad that they've been useful. Remember, there will still be one tomorrow. What I would ask you, because it's difficult for me just to look and take note of people's names and email addresses now, is that if you are interested in finding out more about our face-to-face training, please could you email me. If you just drop a very quick email just saying what you're interested in, and I'll get back to you. But yes, feel free to tune in tomorrow. I haven't seen any any other questions, so unless that's anything else, I will be finishing this seminar, but feel free to join us tomorrow at 2 p.m. as well. So thank you very much and have a good day.